Episode 17, The Marcomannic Wars, 170 to 179 AD. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. Last time, we saw the Pax Romana fracture under the pressure of war, plague, and invasion. Never again would tranquility reign for so long over so large an area. The war with Parthia had been a success, but it had grave consequences. The relocation of soldiers to the east led to the abandonment of Scotland and a thinning of the defenses along the Danube River. Worst of all, Roman soldiers in Parthia brought home the Antonine Plague, which caused devastation across the empire. One of the two emperors, Lucius Verus, died from the disease in 169. The armies were crippled by sickness. Taking advantage of these circumstances, German, Sarmatian, and Dacian tribes coordinated and invaded across the Danube River into Roman territory, burning, looting, enslaving. Marcus Aurelius was able to drive back a wave of the invaders, but more were coming. While the emperor and his army were in the middle of a punitive campaign, the king of the Marcomanni, Balomar, led out a huge coalition army made up of several tribes, crossed into Roman territory, and rushed toward Italy. With the imperial army tied up elsewhere, the home province lay nearly undefended. That's where we ended things last time, with the barbarians on the march and Marcus and his army racing to block their advance. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1. Roman Reign. Part 2. Cassius. Part 3. Meditations, which is available exclusively to Patreon members. Part 4. Marcommania. Part 1. Roman Reign. As we return to the story of the Marcomannic War, I'd like to reiterate the tentativeness of this sequence of events. There's much scholarly disagreement on what happened when, particularly early on during the war. Our sources aren't clear, and evidence from inscriptions doesn't set things in order. What I'm explaining here is the order which is most coherent in my opinion, but I could be convinced otherwise. I'm putting Balomar's invasion at the year 170, but others place it as early as 167. Feel free to carry some doubts or skepticism. What happened is much more clear than when each event happened. As the Marcomannic coalition rushed across the Danube, their first major obstacle was Carnuntum. This town was centered around a legionary base along the Danube River, about 40 kilometers southeast of modern Vienna. Carnuntum was also home to the Pannonian fleet of boats which patrolled the river. However the Marcomanni crossed the river, this fleet was unprepared to stop their surprise attack. The Marcomanni met the Pannonian legion not far from Carnuntum. A large battle followed, and the Romans suffered a harsh defeat. Despite the town's importance, in the aftermath, Carnuntum was not sacked. Perhaps its walls appeared too formidable, perhaps richer fields of plunder beckoned. The barbarians rushed on, heading south and west toward Italy. Their next target was Opitergium, modern Oderzo, Italy. This town had no walls. With no defenses, Opitergium was sacked and razed to the ground by the Germans. Their next destination on their spree of destruction was Aquileia, which lay on the path to the undefended riches of Italy. Unlike at Carnuntum, the previous walled city the Germans had approached, they stopped here and put Aquileia under siege. The rapid advance, thanks to the Roman roads, caught the Romans completely off guard. Although Aquileia was able to shut its gates and hide behind its walls, no army was nearby to relieve it. Marcus and his army were preoccupied, pulling out of their punitive campaign against the Iazyges, a Sarmatian tribe. That campaign had been no walk in the park for the Romans either. The general Marcus Claudius Fronto, who had served under Lucius Verus in last decade's Parthian War, died in this fighting. Not suspecting a siege, Aquileia would have had no time to stock supplies. It surely would not hold out long, so it was imperative that a relief army drive the Germans off before the city starved, surrendered, or was sacked. The first Roman response came from the Praetorian prefect, Victorinus. He and his army marched to Aquileia to crush the Germans against the walls. But the Germans were a formidable fighting force. They defeated the Roman army and killed Victorinus. Or at least that's one interpretation of our incomplete sources. The other being that Victorinus and his men died at the hands of the plague, not the Germans. More uncertainty. In either case, the siege of Aquileia in 170 stretched into the early months of 171. Finally free of their entanglements with the Sarmatians, Marcus and his army crossed back into Roman territory and sped for Aquileia. The generals leading this army were Marcus Aurelius' new son-in-law, Pompeianus, and a general named Pertinax, who will play an important role in our story in a couple of decades. The army of Balamar was still camped outside of Aquileia, unable to break in. When word arrived of the large and skilled army of their emperor fast approaching, Balamar had two choices: turn and flee, or be crushed between the Roman army and the walls of the city. And so, the Germans fled. Aquileia and the rest of Italy were spared. This episode demonstrates the importance of walled towns. The towns that Balamar and his army encountered that were walled survived. Those without walls, like Opitergium, were ransacked. The Germans were formidable on the battlefield, often able to go toe-to-toe with the Romans. But without a cadre of skilled engineers, the Romans could usually rely on hiding behind their town walls until the army could save them. This will be a theme for the remaining 3 centuries of the empire. Both sides must have taken away clear lessons. For the Romans, wall the towns. For the Germans, don't get bogged down in a siege. Who knows how far into Italy or how much destruction Balamar's army might have caused if they had continued past the walls of Aquileia. After the Germans fled, the Roman army followed and expelled the Germans back across the Danube, and for the moment, disaster had been averted. The situation stabilized. But a ways to the east, another tribe of barbarians had taken advantage of imperial inattention. On the lower Danube, not far from where it empties into the Black Sea, a tribe called the Costoboci, probably of unconquered Dacian origin, crossed the river and began to raid into Moesia and Thrace. The border was suddenly very porous. The legion, which should have been nearest the point of their crossing, had recently been moved upstream by Marcus Aurelius to better protect the heart of Dacia. This move backfired. The Costoboci were able to raid throughout Thrace unopposed. With no significant resistance, they moved south into Greece. The Roman system of defense was ill-equipped to deal with small, fast-moving raids within the empire. Once the border was penetrated, the interior was defenseless. A legion or vexillation of a legion would have to be sent out to deal with the invaders. Until they caught up with them, though, the raiders had free rein to kill, loot, and enslave. The Costoboci didn't just reach Macedonia in the north of Greece, places like Philippi or Thessalonica. They penetrated far into Greece. The ancient travel writer Pausanias writes of their coming to Elatia in central Greece near Thebes. An army of bandits called the Costobocs, who overran Greece in my day, visited among other cities Elatia, whereupon a certain Mnesibolus gathered around him a company of men and put to the sword many of the barbarians, but he himself fell in the fighting. Whether embellished or not, we can see from this account that the locals were not entirely passive. In the face of barbarian war bands, some of the locals formed militias and attempted to defend themselves. This usually proved ineffective, but it's a colorful glimpse into the time period and the psyche of those affected by the raids. By late summer of 170, these barbarians had brought their trail of destruction all the way to a site just 14 miles from Athens itself. While Athens was spared, the target of their raid was significant. It was Eleusis, the home of the Eleusinian mysteries. They looted and destroyed the religious infrastructure there, ending, for a time, the millennia-long history of secret mystical rites. The contemporary orator Aristides lamented the destruction of this holy site, saying, "Who should grieve more, the uninitiated or the initiated? The one group has been deprived of the fairest sights which they have seen, the other of what they could have seen. O you who have evilly betrayed the mysteries, who have revealed what was hidden, common enemies of the gods beneath and above the earth. O you Hellenes who were children of old, and now are truly children, who stood idly by at the approach of so great an evil, will you not now, dear sirs, at all events, get control of yourselves? Will you not even save Athens?" Reaching or raiding so far from home was difficult work. Whether due to being killed by a militia, the approach of winter, or being weighed down by loot, the Costoboci went no farther. The final impetus to return home was the arrival of a vexillation of soldiers led by a commander named Julianus. They defeated the barbarians and sent them fleeing. Italy had been attacked, Greece plundered. The Marcomannic coalition had done real damage, not just to the army, but to civilians and infrastructure. So, can we agree that the Pax Romana had ended? The end of the Pax Romana should date to the beginning of the plague, which remember is still circulating, or to the beginning of the Marcomannic War. But the peace and ease of the past 2 centuries were over. Difficult days were ahead. As the Marcomannic Wars continue, we're going to avoid a play-by-play of every military movement. 2 obstacles make this necessary: the long duration of the war and the lack of clarity on the granular details. What follows is a higher-level view of the war. Later in 171, Marcus Aurelius led a Roman army out to the Danube frontier. He set up his base of operations in a forward position in Carnuntum, the town and legionary base that had suffered a great defeat at the hands of Balamar. With Roman territory free from invaders, it was time to shore things up and turn to offense. Take the fighting to the enemy's turf. Emperor Marcus had established a force to protect the Alpine crossings into Italy and strengthened the Danube fleet. His army crossed the Danube at several sites to inflict retaliation on the Marcomanni and their allies. The results of these Roman raids were inconclusive, but they were enough to assert Roman strength and bring several tribes in the Marcomannic coalition to the negotiating table. In one raid, a Roman commander named Maximianus fought and killed the chief of a tribe in single combat. For this tribe, that was enough to stand down and negotiate. The Quadi and the Iazyges also were eager to come to a truce. They had a long history of being Roman allies, and a tribe called the Hastingi Vandals agreed to become Roman allies. This flipping of sides may seem odd, but each tribe was eager not to miss out on the financial benefits of Roman friendship. The Marcomanni were still not adequately punished or contrite, so in 172, Marcus led out a larger force to march into the Marcomannic homeland. This campaign was a success. The Marcomanni negotiated peace, and in the aftermath, Marcus adopted the title Germanicus and printed coins stating Germania Capta, subjugated Germania. Prisoners of war captured by Balamar were returned to Rome, and a neutral zone was established north of the Danube. Details are lacking, but the Romans must have been brutal in their reprisals. Whatever happened, the Quadi, who had just signed a peace treaty with the Romans, broke the peace and came to the aid of their Marcomannic cousins. Likewise, the Iazyges broke their treaty in response to rhetoric calling for their complete removal from their lands, whether through genocide or relocation. Just as the war seemed to be ending, a new front had opened. Marcus had by this point transformed himself into an effective commander, which is all the more remarkable given his distaste for war. He would have much preferred reading and discussing philosophy in Rome. But more than anything else, Marcus was dutiful. He rose to the occasion, no matter what it was. In this next phase of the war, targeting the Quadi and the Iazyges, Roman armies cut their way through modern Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary. The heartland of the Quadi was just east of the Marcomanni in modern Slovakia. Resistance from the Germans and Sarmatians was fierce. Their fighting was disciplined. Their leaders were well aware of how Roman armies operated. The Romans won some battles and lost others, but slowly, the broad sweep of the campaign went in Rome's favor throughout 173. The Romans nearly suffered a crushing defeat later in that year, though. They were only saved by what everyone at the time attributed to divine intervention. In the heat of summer in 173, the Roman army, supposedly led by the emperor himself, was deep in the territory of the Quadi. It was hot, and they were on flat, exposed terrain, devoid of both shade and water. Worse, a huge army of the Quadi hemmed in the legions, blocking access to fresh water. Though the legions stood shield to shield, each hour they grew weaker and more desperate. The Quadi could wait for the Romans to begin to drop and then rush in and finish them off. The legions seemed doomed. Then, out of nowhere, it began to rain. And not just a drizzle, but an absolute downpour, so intense that the legions could take off their helmets and drink from the rainwater pooling inside. Seeing their opportunity fading, the Quadi rushed at the Romans. But now lightning and hail struck at the Quadi. They turned and fled. Divine intervention was clear. The gods smiled upon the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius. That was the pagan interpretation, at least. The Christians also quickly jumped on this instance of divine intervention. In fact, the earliest surviving reference to the event is from the Christian writer Tertullian. In his telling, a cohort of the army was made up of Christians from the city of Melitene in Anatolia, near Armenia. When they, as a company, prayed for relief from the heat and their enemies, God answered their prayers and delivered them. Historians are quick to poke holes in this Christian version of the story. A whole legion of Christians fighting next to Marcus Aurelius, who was no fan of the Christians? Unlikely. We're still 130 years from Constantine. One takeaway from this side of the story, though, is that these early Christians, including Tertullian, apparently had no qualms about Christians fighting for the army of the Romans. Another testimony to the rain miracle is found in Rome today on the column of Marcus Aurelius. This column, in much the same manner as Trajan's column, records in spiral sculpted relief the military achievements of the emperor. On the column is a depiction of Jupiter. In one of the scenes on the column is a depiction of Jupiter sending rain upon the legions. Notably, no lightning is pictured in this scene, though elsewhere lightning is depicted striking the enemy. Perhaps these two incidents, the rain and the lightning, were quickly conflated in the telling. Whatever god or unexpected meteorology had intervened to save the Romans, the momentum and morale was shifting in their favor. Marcus had reshaped himself from a student of philosophy to a master of war. He had become a skilled strategist and tactician, an inspiring leader of his men, and a dedicated force for Rome. With the Roman war machine buzzing, the king of the Quadi began to signal he was ready for peace. The fighting men of the Quadi were not quite ready to surrender, though. They overthrew their king Firtius and replaced him with an anti-Roman king named Ariogassus. The new king doubled down on war with Rome, but the writing was on the wall. Marcus and his army soon captured the new king, and rather than execute him, the emperor showed his magnanimity by exiling the new king to Alexandria. Kingless, the Quadi finally came to peace. The Iazyges were the last major holdout in the fighting. The battle-hardened armies were now directed fully against the Sarmatian horsemen, intent on fully eliminating their dangerous presence. Marcus led some campaigns during the years 173 to 175, but his generals Pertinax and Pompeianus led most of the fighting. Marcus governed from Carnuntum. He held court here and received embassies from the Germans. He navigated treaties and called on allies to help attack Rome's enemies. Carnuntum became basically a capital for the time. With the emperor was his wife, Faustina, who was given the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camp. The soldiers apparently loved having the Augusta herself in their camp with them. The usually unreliable Historia Augusta is full of stories of escapades between Faustina and sailors, soldiers, and gladiators. But whether out of his stoicism or her fidelity, Marcus remained devoted to her. Outside of gossip, there's no evidence of infidelity on her part. The war with the Iazyges continued into 175, and notably Cassius Dio recounts that the fiercest battle of this phase of the war took place not in Roman territory, nor in Iazig territory, but on the frozen Danube itself. The two sides fought a slippery battle in which the legions withstood the charges and flanking maneuvers of the Iazig horsemen. The Iazyges soon sought peace, but as the lone holdouts, they were not offered any treaty. The desperate Iazyges were faced with extinction. But in May of 175, they received their own miracle, when far-off events pulled the emperor's attention away. Marcus Aurelius suddenly needed all the soldiers he could spare. He quickly made peace with the Iazyges on favorable terms. Part 2. Cassius. Let's back up a few years and return to the east where the hero of the Parthian War, Avidius Cassius, was governor of Syria. Cassius was born in Syria, but grew up in Alexandria. His father was an orator who had served under Hadrian and Antonius, and his mother was a distant descendant of Augustus, Herod the Great, and the royalty of a small kingdom called Commagene. In the last episode, we saw how Cassius had rapidly risen through the ranks to command one of the main divisions of the army in the Parthian War. He defeated a Parthian army on the battlefield and then sacked the city of Seleucia and entered into the enemy capital, Ctesiphon. In the aftermath, he had been awarded with the governorship of Syria, one of the most prestigious posts in the empire. In 172, a revolt broke out in the south of Egypt from among a group of herdsmen called the Bokoloi. Led by the Egyptian priest Isidorus, the revolt spread among the natives. More than just the herdsmen were disaffected. It seems the trigger for the revolt was an increase in the tax rate. Why this increase? Well, to fund the massive campaigns of Marcus Aurelius on the northern frontier. We'll come back to this cost shortly, but Marcus was unable to personally respond to this rebellion. The Bokoloi managed to defeat a Roman army, then advanced as far as Alexandria. They disrupted the grain shipments to Rome and put Alexandria under siege. In response, Marcus Aurelius gave Cassius imperium, supreme military command over the whole east of the empire. With Alexandria about to fall to the rebels, Cassius quickly arrived. Rather than fighting the rebels altogether, he was able to separate them and pick them off one by one. Alexandria was saved. Already a hero for his work in the Parthian War, Cassius' star had risen even higher. Perhaps too high. On May 3rd of 175, the Egyptian legion hailed Avidius Cassius as emperor. Cassius did nothing to restrain these acclamations. Quickly, the whole east of the empire was in rebellion. Cassius and his supporters sent messages to Rome seeking the Senate's support. If you were an observer in Alexandria, you might think the reign of Marcus Aurelius was coming to an end. So, what happened? Were the soldiers dissatisfied? Was there conflict among the senatorial elite? Was it a pure power grab by Cassius while Marcus was busy subduing the northern barbarians? It was perhaps just a misunderstanding. In the spring of 175, Marcus was ill. He had always suffered from illnesses. Never debilitating, but enough to lead him to eat only one meal a day. It's a testament to his fortitude that he endured this weakness, living in the rough conditions of military camps for most of the past 10 years. He didn't cloister himself in the baths or at a countryside estate. This illness helps explain why last decade he had summoned Galen, the famous physician, to come to his court in Aquileia. Well, in 175, despite his best attempts to hide his illness from others, Marcus was sicker than usual. Rumors of his illness seemed to have circulated. Most concerned for his health was his wife, Faustina. She had a lot to lose if Marcus died at that moment. Her eldest son, Commodus, was a teenager, but not yet a man. If Marcus died, it was likely that Commodus and Faustina would be tossed aside by a usurper or used as pawns in someone else's chess match. With these anxieties, she only did what was natural. She wrote a letter to a friend. The catch was that her friend was the governor of Syria, who had imperium over all of the East. It was Cassius. Her letter apparently was a plea for help, in case Marcus died. She seems to have offered her hand in marriage to him on the condition that he protect her and her son, and that Commodus should be his successor. Cassius must have been intrigued. Marrying Faustina would have given him all the legitimacy he would need to have a strong claim to be emperor when Marcus passed. But Cassius jumped the gun. Perhaps unintentionally. Maybe Faustina made his condition sound worse than it actually was. Maybe Cassius misunderstood and thought Marcus was actually dead already. Cassius would have wanted a jump start on any other claimants. Or maybe it was all intentional. Perhaps Faustina hadn't wanted to wait around for Marcus to die. Or maybe Cassius decided that Marcus was weak and his army preoccupied, and there was no better time to strike than now. There was no need to wait for Marcus to die. It could have been a pure power grab by him. Although Marcus is one of the, quote, good emperors, that didn't mean everyone was happy. There was some wiggle room for Cassius to tap in to dissatisfaction. First, there was the war. The long war in the north, which had lasted nearly 10 years by this point. Not to mention, it followed directly on the heels of the war with Parthia in the early 160s. The war was costly both in manpower and in money. Up to 140,000 soldiers were deployed in these campaigns. It was expensive to supply and feed all of them. To pay for all of this, Marcus had to order a debasement of the currency. Inflation quickly picked up and strained the purchasing power of everyone in the empire. And of course, there were deaths. It's estimated up to 10% of the Roman soldiers died during the war in combat. And we have to remember that the plague also took its toll. So, while the importance of the war was clear to everyone who remembered how close the Marcomanni had been to taking Aquileia and reaching the heart of Italy, there was a faction that felt the war was too expensive or had gone on too long. Like Aurelius, I've been focused on the Danube frontier, but there was trouble elsewhere too. The Caledonians were raiding into Roman Britain. Berber tribes had crossed from North Africa to Hispania and raided there, and the trouble with the Germans wasn't limited to the Danube. Though smaller in scale, the Chauci and the Chatti tribes had raided across the Rhine River, maybe in collaboration with Balamar's coalition. All of these raids were stopped and reversed, but some, probably those farthest from the Danube, may have felt the emperor's attention was excessively fixated on his war there. And lastly, as often happened, there were some among the Senate who felt that they were being mistreated. During his reign as co-emperor, the family of Lucius Verus had become accustomed to special treatment. Now that Marcus was ruling solo, their privilege went unfulfilled. A small but notable faction in the Senate had begun to murmur with discontent over Marcus Aurelius. All of these sentiments, the grind of the war, the focus of Marcus on one frontier at the expense of the others, and the discontentment of a few in the Senate, were opportunities that Cassius hoped to tap into. So with all these considerations in play, the whole east of the empire, from Egypt to Antioch, was in rebellion. Cassius could call upon 7 legions. The prefect of Egypt even issued an edict to the people of the province recognizing the ascension of Cassius. Whether or not Cassius thought Marcus was dead when he rebelled, he did not change course when he soon found out that the emperor was very much alive. This was now no misinterpretation. If the rebellion seemed poised to spread farther, it hit a brick wall in Marcius Verus. This Marcius was another leader of the Parthian War of the last decade. He now served as the governor of Cappadocia and was a staunch ally of Marcus. Rather than join the rebellion, he quickly sent word to Marcus of the insurrection brewing in the east. At the same time, Rome itself got word of Cassius's rebellion. The Senate quickly declared Avidius Cassius an enemy of the state. Perhaps the fact that Cassius was basing his power out of Alexandria made the Rome-based senators fearful that they would be left out in the cold in a new Eastern-focused administration. Either way, he had greatly overestimated the support he would receive in the Senate. One senator sent Cassius a letter with only one word on it, Immanes, meaning, "You are mad." While the Senate was nearly united in condemning Cassius, the people of the city were not so confident in Marcus. We hear that there was unrest due to fears of civil war and perhaps even fighting within Rome itself. Maybe they had read their history of the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD, or the civil wars of Caesar, Pompey, Antony, Sulla, and Marius. Marcus, up to this point, had been unaware of Cassius's actions. News from Egypt would have taken a week at minimum to reach Carnuntum, or the campaign tent of Marcus across the frontier. He was preoccupied in the midst of his war of extermination with the Iazyges. Suddenly, he had to offer them generous peace terms. His first action was to send to Rome the governor of Pannonia Inferior to maintain order and secure the capital for Marcus. Cassius Dio gives us a speech of Marcus to his men as they headed east, surely invented by Dio, but probably hitting on some real themes. Marcus expressed regret that Cassius was rebelling more for the sake of the empire and the violence that would soon follow than for his own security. He committed to showing clemency to Cassius if he just surrendered. Still, he could not risk letting the rebellion fester. Much of the empire relied on grain shipments from Egypt and tax revenue from the east. Marcius Verus, the loyal governor of Cappadocia, descended from the highlands of Anatolia with his legion and marched for Antioch. Marcus himself soon set out for the east, with his family in tow. Before leaving the Danube, Marcus gave to Commodus the toga virilis, marking his entry into manhood. There would be no mistake that Commodus, not Cassius, would succeed Marcus Aurelius. Civil war seemed to be coming. But as it became clear that Marcus Aurelius was alive and on his way to Egypt, with his battle-hardened army, a local officer took matters into his own hands. A centurion from the Egyptian legion assassinated Cassius, severed his head, and sent it to Marcus. Just like that, 3 months after Cassius had been hailed as emperor, the rebellion was over. The empire had been spared a bloody civil war. When Marcius Verus arrived in Antioch under the orders of the emperor, he burned the correspondence of Cassius to avoid incriminating anyone else. Marcus himself also took a conciliatory posture. He wrote to the Senate asking for a full list of co-conspirators, but asked that no violence should come to them. There were some consequences, of course. The commander of the Cassius's legion in Alexandria was killed, as was one of Cassius's sons. Both of these killings were extra-legal and not officially ordered by Marcus. Another son of Cassius was exiled. Although the threat was gone, the rebellion must have been a wake-up call to Marcus that he could not neglect the east any longer. He continued his march through Anatolia. As the imperial procession crossed Anatolia that winter, Faustina suddenly died. It's unknown what caused her death, but you can imagine the conspiracy theories that followed. Things like wondering if it was Marcus that poisoned her after discovering her plotting with Cassius. But this line of thinking seems unlikely on the evidence we have. There's no real evidence of her betrayal or infidelity. All of that stuff seems to be ancient tabloid talk. The actions of Marcus don't show any resentment toward her. He renamed the city where Faustina died as Faustinopolis. When he later returned to Rome, he had the Senate deify her, and he began a charity school for orphaned girls in her honor. Not exactly the behavior of a resentful man. Despite the death of his wife, Marcus, Commodus, and the imperial entourage continued their tour of the east, skipping past Antioch because the city had thrown its support behind Cassius. Instead, they moved south and eventually came to Alexandria. The emperor toured the city and gave it the attention it felt it deserved. In early 176, Marcus and Commodus sailed out of the port of Alexandria, bound for Athens. Part 3. Miscellaneous Meditations. That which is not good for the swarm is not good for the bee. Do not act as if you will live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, do good. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. As Marcus arrived in Athens, Rome's philosopher king arrived at the home city of Plato. It was a fitting spiritual homecoming for Marcus. After spending nearly his entire reign in warfare, there was finally peace across the empire. The Parthians were quiet, the northern barbarians were stopped beyond the boundary rivers, and no rebellions threatened the peace. It had been a trying reign for the emperor, especially considering the juxtaposition of the tranquility of his predecessor Antoninus and the constant troubles of Marcus's reign. Marcus had grown up and witnessed that peace and stability. It probably would have been his expectation that his reign would be similar. But that's not what the gods delivered to Marcus. He could have pouted or retreated from the challenges he faced, but his Stoic philosophy had prepared his resolve to bear any challenge. He and his son toured the sites of Athens, so enriched 40 years earlier by Hadrian's particular patronage of the city. Part of the tour included a day trip out of town to Eleusis, home to the Eleusinian Mysteries. As mentioned earlier, the shrine had been ravaged less than a decade ago by the barbarian Kostoboji. At some point, either immediately after the destruction or on his personal visit, Marcus pledged funds to rebuild the site. In the ruins today, a plaque still recognizes his contribution. He and Commodus were inaugurated into the Mysteries. The highlight of Marcus's stop in Athens, though, was the creation of 4 new philosophy heads, one each for 4 schools of philosophy: Epicureanism, Platonism, Aristotelianism, and, yes, of course, Stoicism. These positions were given an endowment, ensuring their quality and continuity. Before long, it was time to return to Rome. He had not set foot there in the capital since 169, when he escorted his recently deceased co-emperor Lucius there. Yes, it was time to go back. Duty demanded it. If Antoninus was pious, Marcus was dutiful. But it wasn't going to be all paperwork and meetings. It was time for a triumph. Not for avoiding the civil war with Cassius, but for establishing peace against the Germans and the Sarmatians. In the triumph, Commodus rode through Rome beside his father. In imitation of Trajan's column, the column of Marcus Aurelius was erected. Its spiral relief shows a story of the Marcomannic Wars in picture form. It's still there today in Rome, in the Piazza Colonna. The remainder of this section is available exclusively to Patreon members. It discusses Marcus's time in Rome, as brief as it was, a few reforms he made, and of course, his meditations, perhaps his most influential legacy. We go through a small sample of his meditations and do a little bit of analysis. If you've enjoyed this series so far, please consider becoming a $2 or $4 per month subscriber. Your contributions help the show to survive and continue. Thanks for all of your support. Now, back to the narrative. Part 4: Marcommania. Emperor Marcus Aurelius was not afforded a long rest after his triumph in Rome. In 177, with peace still fresh, the Germanic Quadi tribe broke their side of the treaty, at least according to the Romans, and began raiding into Pannonia. The Marcomanni couldn't look past their neighbors getting to enjoy all the spoils for themselves, so they also broke their peace with Rome and raided into Noricum. Oy vey. The Historia Augusta tells us a tribe called the Hermanudri and the Sarmatians, meaning the Iazyges, also rebelled once again. The Quadi, at least, seem to have broken their treaty because of their frustration with new Roman forts in their territory. These were meant to keep the peace, but what they really did was provide a place for the dissidents of the tribe to escape and prevent the tilling of the land nearby. Apparently, the Romans were harassing the Quadi farmers in the area. The Quadi were incensed, and they went back to war. You can imagine the exasperation even the stoic Marcus must have let slip. Couldn't they leave him and his empire in peace? It's no wonder that he wrote his meditations, which we discussed in the last section during this time. He needed the reminders he wrote in his journal to keep his mind focused on virtue and reason and far from self-pity. Dutiful as ever, Marcus returned to the Danube frontier. His son Commodus was with him. The boy in 177 was now 16 years old and officially co-ruled with his father. Before setting out, he had been made a co-emperor. Marcus, of course, still called the shots in reality. This next phase of the war is sometimes called the Second Marcomannic War, lasting from 177 to 180. We know even less details about this phase of the conflict than the first phase. Marcus was stationed again at Carnuntum. With his health worsening, he only occasionally crossed the Danube frontier. His time was spent in administering the empire, and we know he wrote much of his meditations during this period. Leading his campaigns were the commanders Maximianus and Paternus. The Marcomanni were targeted first. Victories were easier to come by in this phase of the war. Marcus and his legions were both better prepared to defeat the Germans after years of practice. The Marcomanni were pushed back. So were the Quadi. The Romans followed into German territory. Winter quarters were established in Germania, legionary forts set up quickly. Behind these wooden walls, the legions could hold out against barbarian attacks and control territory, preventing them from having an opening to counterattack. The Danube defenses were also strengthened. In 179, a fort of earth and timber was built on a hill overlooking the confluence of the Naab River and the Danube River, called Castra Regina. It was soon rebuilt in stone. Today, that camp has grown to become the German city of Regensburg. The Marcomanni came to peace first, and afterwards the campaign turned to the east in the lands of the Quadi. In 179, we know Maximianus led the Romans to a victory over the Quadi deep in modern Slovakia. An inscription has been preserved in the town of Trenčín from 179 commemorating the victory. The inscription, carved into the rock in Latin, says, "To the victory of the emperors in the army of 855 soldiers of the 2nd Legion that was based at Laugaricio, made to order of Marcus Valerius Maximianus, a legate of the 2nd Auxiliary Legion." From this inscription, we get physical evidence of the war deep in Quadi territory. The Quadi were on the run and pursued deep into Germania. Marcus was hailed as Imperator for a 10th time by his men. But the war was not yet over. In this later phase of the war, Marcus began to think longer term. How do you prevent the tribes from breaking the next truce like they did the last? More forts were being built in enemy territory, and it appears Marcus planned for the creation of 2 new provinces north of the Danube, Marcommania and Sarmatia. Marcommania would cover the lands of the Marcomanni and the Quadi, while Sarmatia would cover the lands of the Iazyges, across the river from modern Vienna, where it suddenly turns from flowing eastward to southward. Chronologically, we have to end here. With the war nearly over, with Marcus planning for a final solution to the northern frontier problem, but at the same time growing sicker and weaker. Before we end this decade, let's take a step back and look at the Marcomannic Wars and their impact. The wars began due to both push and pull factors. It appears the tribes living closest to Roman territory were consolidating under the pressure of more distant tribes who had begun to encroach on their lands. Far away to the northeast, the Goths and other tribes were on the move, pushing and pressuring the German tribes in their path. Pull factors also played a part. These were the richness of Roman territory, both in untilled fertile land and in undefended towns ready to be raided. The raids began small, but quickly grew to levels which were impossible for the Romans to effectively control. They could only focus on the largest bands of raiders. Defense and retaliation required a huge number of soldiers. It wasn't just about increasing the size of the army, but about filling in gaps. The wars with the Germans were deadly, and the Antonine Plague was deadlier. Many soldiers died, in their camps or on campaign. It was costly to supply all of these new soldiers too. Huge expenditures were needed for the soldiers and to pay for logistically supporting them on campaign. The imperial treasury, so carefully filled under Antoninus Pius, was quickly drained on this war, which followed after the Parthian War. With imperial funds in short supply, Marcus did the only thing he could to pay his soldiers. He debased the currency. Inflation soon resulted, which weakened everyone in the empire's purchasing power. Inflation was nothing new, but it ratcheted up during Marcus's reign. Slowly and painfully, the Germans and Sarmatians were driven back and brought to peace. Their time in Roman territory left behind two things: burned cities and German settlers. At this point, the numbers were still small, but the Romans allowed the resettlement of some Germans within the empire on uncultivated land. Ancient states were always looking for more population because more population meant more tax revenue. And organic growth through trade or innovation was painfully slow. Increasing the population through resettlement was a quick way to increase tax revenue. In the coming centuries, the number of barbarian settlers inside the bounds of the empire will only increase. So too will increase attacks from across the Danube or the Rhine rivers. If the Romans thought that the trouble would end once the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and their friends were cowed, they were sorely mistaken. In the short term, next decade, we finally say goodbye to Marcus Aurelius. It will be a sad goodbye. He has become a constant figure in the show ever since his first mention way back at the end of Hadrian's life in the 130s. Yes, next time we will say goodbye to Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, and get to know his son, who will surely be just as wise and even-handed as his father, right? If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you can vouch for Commodus's sensibilities. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider supporting the show by becoming a Patreon member. You'll get access to exclusive content, including part of this episode, and be able to communicate with me and other listeners in the episode comments on Patreon. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.